Thanks, John. The last model that you showed reminds where essentially questions are brought to the data and could be done across a number of federated databases reminds me a lot of the HMO Research Network and the Sentinel system. But in building Sentinel, they had to make sure that the data in each of the federated sites was sort of enabled apples to apples comparisons. Do you think that's also going to be true in that model where you're sort of seeking to ask queries across a bunch of databases? You're not going to be able to merge those results if the data behind that isn't standardized in some way.
Yeah, that's exactly right. A lot of this requires collective behavior by research platform providers who have not shown a lot of skill in collective behavior. That's true of us as well. I'm not hitting anybody without hitting myself and my group. A lot of this theory comes from a guy at Microsoft Research named Jim Gray who sailed out of the Bay and disappeared about 10 years ago. But he saw a world where the data would be too big or too sensitive to leave, and the models would need to visit them. And what I like about his theory is that you don't get to interoperability by saying we're going to get to interoperability, forming a working group, and overfunding it. You do by defining 5 queries that need to work. And then everyone makes those queries work, and only those. It doesn't create a freak out that says, oh my God, you're going to have access to everything. You say, no, we need these records. And then when those work, you add 5 more. And when those work, you add 5 more. And you go from working query to working query. And it is the root of how I think we get there for this. And these kinds of symposia are important because if patients require us to be interoperable, we'll eventually be interoperable because the power at the end of the day is from the people who give permission to do the research. But this is why I encourage, as you think about control, to go beyond, do I have a copy? And under what terms will you govern it? Because that is how I think, it's what's the Nancy Pelosi used this quote yesterday, with public sentiment, all is possible. Without public sentiment, nothing is possible.
And I'd like to actually hear just from everybody, what is the best model that you've seen for patient interoperability and communication? That is not just somebody calling up, trying to withdraw their DNA from a study, but actually where patients, according to the original outlines of all of this consent, are notified about what studies their DNA, their health records are involved with, where they can see those records of who it is who has my data, what products have been developed, what studies have been published, have there been any corrections to those studies?
Gosh, I am coming up short in terms of where that's happening. I'm sorry, I'm coming up short in terms of where that's happening.
Yeah, same for me.
Audience participation?
Yeah, I'd be curious if anyone has any good models on this. The one that we've been playing with is less individual and more looking at, in the Convention on Biological Diversity, there's this concept of access and benefit sharing to those indigenous groups that make traditional knowledge available, and we think a lot of what patients have is aligned with traditional knowledge. And so it's not always monetary, but it can often be access to the papers, to the products, and so forth.
I think that's a little bit where the bullishness, I think blockchain got ahead of its skis when it first came out, but I think that's where the bullishness on blockchain, that you would have a public, transparent, immutable, no central administrator, that level of ledgering would be able to happen, and I think that's why everybody got so excited about it, and probably because it hasn't happened as much as it should.
Just to say, we got a proposal into NSF to develop a blockchain true data bank where people can input, where they have interest, where they can withdraw, and where their funds, which is their personal information, are protected. And we didn't get funded, but I'm going to be on a 3 o'clock panel here. But I'd love to hear from anybody who has a good idea of how this has to work, and I'll be here today, and any other speakers who come up, because I do think we all are saying, oh, the patient, or the participant, but really they're not considered in the models or in the design at all. There's no consideration like there is at Apple to the consumer coming in and being able to see things. And adding that after the fact to our studies, I have found almost impossible. So it'd be nice to see some development from the programmers that considers an interface that is clear and easily accessible to my mother. Thanks.
So Dawn's going to answer, but can I ask the panelists from the previous panel to come on up while she answers?
Yeah, and I think that's great. I'm looking forward to your panel. In terms of thinking about blockchain and GDPR, the right to be forgotten, the right to delete yourself, certainly we don't want to put personal information on a blockchain, and it's not robust enough to be carrying big files around. So I look forward to your talk. But I do think the transparency in data usage on top of the anonymity of the people who are participating, I look forward to hearing how that's going to work.
Okay, so now, we're almost a working group up here. I have questions written down for these people, but how often do you have these people up on stage? I significantly encourage you to get to the microphones and ask some questions. Please, go ahead.
I was curious about solutions that don't not only account for active patients and patient advocates, but also cater to more passive consumers or your average patient who's just interacting with the healthcare system.
Dawn, go ahead.
Yep.
Otherwise, I'm going to put you on the spot randomly, just so you know.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I love the earlier comment that when we talk about people don't want, the generalization of all people. I think healthy people have so much to give to research. They're very data engaged. They have, through direct-to-consumer DNA platforms, been opting into research. So at least how we're contemplating it is we welcome healthy people to come in and grab their EHR and upload their DNA data, as well as patients and registries and foundations and other programs that we'll be rolling out soon. But I think we need to think about health not as a status. I'm neither not healthy or healthy, but rather life as a continuum. And if we can start tracking healthy people with longitudinal continuous data, when they get sick, statistically, a lot of us will get sick, to be able to look back in time and not do just retrospective snapshot in time what broke, but what was breaking, what was happening. And I think the biggest opportunity is to bring healthy people into the research equation.
I'd just like to echo that and think of all the lessons learned from the nurses study and other initiatives that track people, healthy people. What? I don't know how much I can unpack it, maybe like a carry-on. So if somebody else understands the details of the nurses study better than me, please chime in. But from what I understand, this is a very large initiative called the Framingham study. And it was, in essence, a way to follow a group of people, nurses, that happened to be healthy at the time of enrollment, or just at whatever stage they were in their health at the time of enrollment, but then they were followed longitudinally for a long time. How long? Decades. And their blood was banked, and surveys were developed, tools were developed and deployed throughout that population, and many studies have been able to come out as a result.
So I wanted to invite Misha to help Corey solve her problem of getting access to data when it's still in the research phase. And I wonder if you could identify, because I know you were part of a team that implemented a kind of a full partnership model at Duke, and I wanted you to identify the obstacles that got in your way that were most important and how you got around those obstacles to incorporate the patients into full partnership.
Well, so greetings from the trough of disillusionment. We tried very hard. This is, beginning in 2011, prior to the HIPAA CLIA revisions. I work at Duke. Duke is a HIPAA-covered entity. And we had a very, very long tete-a-tete with the IRB, upon which I served at the time. And it was very frustrating, and it was part of the impetus for us making this film was to sort of capture these stories and these real life struggles. So, there are sort of unmet expectations and disappointments that abounded. Obviously the families, there's therapeutic misconception. They think that the PhD geneticists are clinicians, and that's not their fault. That's our fault. Research sequencing, especially at that time, took forever. And that was really hard. And in a couple of cases, we actually wound up subsidizing clinical exomes. But we would have participant gatherings every year. But, of course, from the family's perspective, and I'm sure many people in this room know exactly what I'm talking about, is particularly when you have a heterogeneous group where you have all kinds of phenotypes, the momentum, the activation energy that you need to get people together and, kind of unite behind pushing this rock up the hill is hard because everybody has a bit of a different rock. And they all have these enormous care burdens that they're dealing with at home. And I'll just shut up after one particular moment of clarity where I started going to, they're not called advocate, I think they're patient liaisons at Duke. I started going to their meetings, and the sort of most well-attended, vigorously participated in meeting was about parking. And I just thought, I have no idea what's important to any particular population. So we tried, and we learned empirically how hard this is.
We're going to go. So Dawn's going to comment, then we'll go with you, and then we'll go back and forth. Okay.
A couple more comments on patients as partners in research. I mean, we just asked this question. What do people need to feel engaged, to feel important, to feel like they have a seat at the table? And we're simple things like return my data. Like I'm a patient. I'm struggling through a healthcare condition. Give me the opportunity to take that data somewhere. That was a very valuable asset. Share progress. Offer support systems in the platform. So even if it's just access to genetic counseling, a free 1-hour discussion, that type of thing. Connect not just for this study, but for later studies. So the recognition that the continuous nature, we want to have patient-reported outcomes. We may want to do the study 2 and 3 and 4 years. So let's stay connected, and just do what you say you're going to do with the data, and that's it, nothing else.
I have a question for those of you with platforms that comes from the patient side. There are patient groups such as Corey's angiosarcoma group, the BRCA group, others with genomic conditions, where they have patient groups and they want to track what's happening in that group, but they also want to be part of a study. If their members donate that information to your platform, is the group able to access identified data so that they don't have to keep 2 databases on their members?
So in the studies that we're doing, this is not like a group consenting to the study. It's an individual providing consent to donate their tissue and data to the platform that gets released in aggregate, but there's no return of result. So it would be, we can't release individual level data to an individual where we can't release it to the entire group.
We have to have a connecting system. So our platform, we don't know who's in the platform. It's #ABCDFG, but for the population health programs or the other discoveries, there does have to be a connection back to who that individual is, because you have a registry who's managing a lot of things that requires that person's identity.
So I'm the wrong person to answer this question, but Adam's not in the room. Cavatica has an e-honest broker system that does allow for some patient re-identification, but I don't know how much the patient can access at this point in time. The end result is that they want patients to be able to track their own data alongside this other de-identified data, but I couldn't answer specifically what it's able to do at this moment in time.
I'm thinking of a little bigger picture, not that the individual patients can re-identify data, but for instance, in our case with ROS1 positive patients, we are very rare, we're global, and people don't find each other very easily. So we would like to be able to have our patients donate data so that we can study treatments and sequencing, et cetera, and have researchers access it, so it has to be de-identified. But as a group, we also want to track where our patients are and what their conditions are and treatments so we can connect people to each other. And it's a pain in the butt to have two databases.
Right. No, I completely agree. And it's just a duplication of effort. So there's definitely a movement toward that group as well, not your specific group, but groups in general. And I think there's been some work around that with Encore DOMA, which is also a fairly rare condition. So again, I am not the right person. I really wish Adam was in here, but that's a space that we should definitely explore, because you're definitely not alone in that concern. I think patients find their own little groups, and they want to know how other people in that group are doing.
So plus one on Encore DOMA, I would urge you to reach out to Josh Summer or anyone at the Encore DOMA Foundation, because they really have grown this organically and I think figured out a lot of this.
Yeah, for us on OpenHumans, if members join a particular community, like members join anonymously, they get a random identifier, but you can always anonymously also interact with those people. So you can message them and you can ask them to provide, for example, demographic data that you're interested in and collect this data as well. So that's definitely possible to some extent on our end.
There's an online question for the panelists with data sharing platforms. And the question is, how many participants are in each of your platforms? And once someone shares their data on your platform, do you have an opt-in or opt-out model?
For all the CountMan studies, we have close to 8,000 participants, and we have the ability for people to opt in and opt out of certain elements during the consent process. But once we've generated data and it gets deposited into the public domain, for example, on CBio portal, it's difficult. We would not have any way of taking that back, because people, like John had alluded to, can download that data. So we could take it off the platform, but it doesn't mean that we can take it out of the computers of people who have downloaded it. What we do have is the ability to stop any future, dealings with that patient's data, so we would not follow up with additional data for that patient. We would basically exit them from the study.
Through our partnerships, we're integrating over 50,000 members at this time. We're still early. We just opened the platform in December. I just want to call out what membership can be a bit of a vanity metric. What you really want is engagement with people. So if they're not opening your emails, if they're not providing data types, it really doesn't matter what your membership numbers are. So engagement is really, really what's important. Who's there to drive the mission with you? And once you pass through the consent, it's opt-in if you want to be contacted for studies. It's opt-in if a researcher wants you to break your anonymity. So we believe in opt-in as the best purveyor of individual's choice.
For us, it's around 8,000 members right now, and not all of them have uploaded any data, but the total number of data sets across all these different data sources, like 22,000 or so, and it's all opt-in. So every data used, the individual opts into this particular research project.
All right, thank you. I'm more interested in what have you seen as the key driver for patients to really share their data? And the ones that are monetizing that platform, how do you prevent data poisoning from that aspect?
Okay, so we have some folks who haven't spoken yet. Bill, do you want to jump in with motivations?
Yeah. key driver for patients in my group is to not die. So it turns out they're looking for hope pretty much from any corner that they can go on and get it. And this is a chip that they can go on and use to barter to get some research done and to go on and meet the needs of the researchers as well.
I would say that the key driver in our studies is one of altruism. And I would also say that we've had a lot of surprises along the way with, in terms of engagement. Whenever we do any kind of twist or turn in any of the projects, we always work through those twists and turns with patients. And one of them was when we were getting ready to do the first data release with metastatic breast cancer data. We did 40 walkthroughs of the data with metastatic breast cancer patients that were part of the project just to see, is there a way that we could make it more accessible, or the ways we could describe it, this and that. We had our own hypotheses about what they would want to see and how they would want to use the data. And man, were we wrong. The theme that came out the most through those walkthroughs that still is just touching to me to this day was when this woman, Beth, had just popped up. We popped the data up, gave her control over our mouse, and she just looked through and clicked through every data element that was there, and she just said, "Oh my God, I'm not alone. You know, look at all of these people that want to save my life and that they want to save my kids' lives." And I would say that, you know, obviously we don't want to die. Obviously, that's the number one motivator. We do not want to die. But we also want to make sure that other people don't die down the road.
Corey, actually occurred to me beyond my initial flip response. There's probably a couple data points that might be useful. I wound up doing this analysis, and I wound up going to a cancer group, and I said, "Hey guys, I wound up doing this analysis. Would you be interested in this too?" And there was a woman there, Madge, says, "Oh no." I said, "Well, why not?" "Well, I'd give up all hope. I mean, it doesn't sound like you wound up getting an answer from this. It was just a waste of time. Why would I do it?" Then I talked to another guy, and another thing too. I said, I did this. And this guy was, I used to work in the oil fields, and I have a relatively brusque approach, and I wound up meeting another guy who also worked in the oil fields, and it turns out he had exactly the same disease as me. And I said, "Well, would you like to work in this thing too?" He says, "Well, I don't really see why I'd bother. I mean, it might let me talk to my researcher in a little bit more detail about what my options are, but it isn't going to go on and solve my problem." So the problem I have to go on and deal with now, in fact, is what do I go on and tell patients to convince them to get involved in this kind of a thing? And here's some of the stuff I've got so far. One is, in fact, is that, well, do you have kids? If it turns out we go on and have some genetic information from you, are you interested in exactly it impacting them? And they usually say, yeah. Second thing I bring up is this point about my aortic acacia. I said, look, these guys go on and have all this data on you. They don't necessarily look at it. And I went on and found out that I've got a heart condition now, and I need to go on and start paying attention to it. If you wind up having a lot of people looking at your medical records, you can go on and deal with this thing called WNL. It says with normal limits inside the chart, but it really means we never looked. Okay, so as a result, I was able to go on and find out, in essence, when my aorta started to open up, and from that I can go on and do some projections going forward. So in line, again, of going on and getting guys to get involved with it, one thing that I have to work with and struggle with, and I'd appreciate input from you guys, is to why should they bother? I mean, that's the words that they go on and give me. Thanks.
Same motivation. Help themselves get through their disease, help the next patient avoid the disease. And I'll just add, I'm on the board of the Alzheimer's Association. I've been fortunate to not be ill, but I have been a caregiver for two parents who were sick at the same time. And so proxy settings in the systems to have the caregivers help with their participation, for the patient's participation in research, is really important.
So we don't do a lot of the sort of direct donation. We mainly run studies, right, study-based. But what we subscribe to the idea that people engage in things for, ontologically, there's like 4 big categories: relatedness, autonomy, mastery, purpose. Mm-hmm. And we lean on purpose a lot in science. And, Patients Like Me was a great example of how relatedness helps. I think patient support groups on Facebook, that's what they do. That's why they're engaging. And I think the spot where we're failing is to give people autonomy and mastery over their day-to-day life or their care protocol. And so if we can find processes that engage people around those things first, that donate data as an after effect to call on purpose, that's when I think we're going to actually win.
Thanks. So it sounds like a lot of the patient-centered portals are always, or platforms are always, the longest epidemiologic cohort studies we could all imagine, and ultimately we'd like to have all the exposure data. So I'm wondering if any of these platforms are making it easier to bring in things like air quality, water quality. You put in your address where you lived, it geolocates that. Is anyone reaching for some of that richness of other open data that patients could attach to their own lives, especially in cancer where environmental data and investigations have been more intractable?
It's such a great question, and it's such an important question because that type of data is not easily obtained or obtainable at all through other methods like getting a patient's medical record. These are things that you sometimes have to specifically engage a patient around and ask them. We are in the process of building out a series of follow-up survey questions that we're deploying to our patients, and we're grappling right now with what should those be. Some of the environmental factors are really interesting, but for sure we're collecting things like zip code. We're seeing what we can and cannot do based on biases that are inherent with an online-driven campaign, and so we have to work around some of those things. But follow-up surveys that have to do with epidemiological questions and environmental and lifestyle factors are absolutely on the radar here.
Yeah, and for us, we are allowing people to put in whatever data they basically want to put in. So we have people who put in their GPS records, either from Google Maps or from specific applications on their smartphone. People have years worth of history of where they've actually been. So at least you know where they've been, and now you can go to some other open data repositories to find the environmental factors which were present at the time. So we are definitely interested in getting the whole picture of data that we can get.
Same here, planned but not integrated yet. And quality control of that data will be super important for robustness in research.
I think we have a tendency to focus our attention on the genetics, and actually genetics is just one part of the whole answer. And we are focused on genetics because it's actually the easy bit. The difficult bit is to actually capture all this richness, this variety, this amount of phenotype, environmental conditions. And actually, even if you have the capability to add that data into the whole picture, I think the other important factors is to how to standardize that information so that the data that you have from different patients, from different environmental conditions is comparable. And therefore, you can perform exhaustive and rigorous analysis with that data.
So I'd just like to add that I think patients are, by and large, interested in an entirely different group of data than researchers are, and that environmental data is far more important in that group. There are some patient-led efforts that are really looking at how to collect that data, but it's challenging, right? Because there's just a lot of variance when you start dealing with that. What comes to mind is an application that was written with a patient driving that. It's called Our Brain Bank, and they're tracking daily symptoms of people with brain tumors. And that's only still capturing, I think, part of what they want to capture. And that's something that we're grappling with, too, on the brain tumor side of things, is just what are those things that are most important to patients, because they're definitely not the same thing that are most important to researchers. And how do we bring that data into a research environment with standards that will make it actually powerful? And I haven't seen anybody that's got a total solution for that, but I think that by and large, everyone that's dealing with big data is trying to address that issue. And I've been impressed anyway with the efforts to try to engage patients around what they're concerned with and help integrate that data.
I actually have a comment. And that is, I wound up talking with a guy the other day, as I went on and mentioned. He said he had urothelial cancer. I thought, that's interesting. So, this is a kidney cancer thing. He says, well, after that, I wound up going on and getting pancreatic cancer. Oh, okay. And now I've got kidney cancer. I said, great. Anything else? He says, yeah, I got brain cancer too. Jesus, what kind of a job did you have? He says, I worked in the oil rigs. It turns out it's just like me. It turns out if you look at the data, you'll see that the biggest incidence of kidney cancer are in Texas, Oklahoma, and South Dakota. Those are all the spots, in fact, where primary oil production is done. Now, having been raised in Houston, I know that. But how in the world are you going to go out and have a standardized form going out and finding that kind of stuff out? One of the points, I'll bring up a point then from a woman named Elizabeth Kerr at Stanford who holds patient seminars there, and everybody gets around a table, and she says the thing that the doctors like the most is sitting down with the patients and actually talking to them. They said, boy, I found out so much stuff. So in fact, instead of a data table where you go on and query on some kind of an environmental factor, if you get a square table and just bring all the patients around there and talk to them about exactly what their experiences are, you find stuff out. I can't help but think that a lot of the data that needs to be gathered right now can't be structured yet. It's all going to arise first off out of unstructured observations and then figuring out what the forms are. If you put the forms in too early, you're not going to go on and discover stuff like that, in my experience.
And so that's actually a great point. I will point out that one of the other things that's hard about doing, to the extent that stuff can be structured, is it's expensive to go and get all of those data sets and make them available. And so I would encourage you to free ride on the NIH. The NIH is doing this in the All of Us research program. I have a conflict of interest. We're a sub-awardee of the Participant Technology Center. But the consent and the protocol both call for extensive data linkage. So this is into census, Social Security, death records, social determinants, environmental data will all be gathered and made available there in a way that you can bring in your data and do those kinds of queries. I actually, to Bill's point, I'm not sure that helps individuals nearly as much as qualitative conversation. But at least at the more aggregate level, for the first time, you're going to be able to query lots of data sets that only like a really richly funded lab would have been able to survive collecting, collating, and making available. And so, as these things become more and more useful, the NIH will probably have funded them to be available to you. And the whole point of all of us is patients can come in and be researchers, right? These don't be afraid to use the government's work. I know it's kind of preaching to the choir, but it's easy to forget. Let's see, you're next.
Can I actually just add one more quick thing to that? Just very briefly, we in all of our intake surveys, we have a very open-ended question. We say, please tell us anything you think we should know about your experience with your disease. And we have thousands of responses for that. And there you can use kind of machine learning. This is where we are right now, trying to use machine learning to take a look at that unstructured data and pull out any themes. And I'll just say, just in my own cancer, there are several people that said bruising, for example. Well, that's a hallmark of radiation-associated angiosarcoma of the breast. There are people that get dogs that have angiosarcoma, and they just want to tell us that, you know what I mean? And so there could be hints that patients, if you ask enough people to just, free associate with their cancer, can provide, and then you can layer on technology to try to parse stuff out.
John, mine is going to fall under the category of a preamble followed by a what do you think?
We'll allow it.
And the reason is because I would like to harness the collective brain power of the panel and also the people in the room. So my name is Jennifer Jennings. For the past 10 years, I've had the great good fortune of managing the International Cancer Genome Consortium Secretariat, which is a collection of 50 different tumor types, and it's 50,000, and making that data freely available to researchers around the world. The issue in terms of the actual resources, the data, is that it was not clinically annotated. It wasn't. We just did not have the records. The manpower or that supply in 2007 when the initiative was launched. The new project that I'm working on is called Accelerating Research in Genomic Oncology, ARGO. And the criteria in order to be a member is to provide either information from a clinical trial or as a compromise an assay. That was a long preamble. My question is, after sitting in the first two sessions this morning, I'm thinking that ICGC ARGO needs to open itself up to patient participants much more broadly, not only through the membership mechanism that we currently have in place. So 2 things. 1, I would invite all of you to join our patient engagement working group. And secondly, how can Luna, how can OpenHuman, how can Sage, Encore DOMA, how can we work together to allow those patients to come and deposit their data in this database?
So I'm going to execute privilege. So I think we should all come talk to you at the break. We have 6 minutes left, and we still have 4 people up.
Okay.
If we answer your question, I think that we will use up all that time. But I strongly encourage, when it's over, come up and stand here, and we can all talk.
Okay, sorry for such a long preamble. As you can tell, I'm not a public speaker.
No,
Thank you, goodbye.
It works out great. It works. We can use the same total amount of time. It's perfect.
Hi, Stacey Gray from City of Hope. I have a 2-part question. The first part is that, I think that we've talked a lot this morning about ways in which a traditional research paradigm is being inverted by a lot of these different sort of disruptive innovations, right? So, profound patient engagement, thinking about new ways of sort of models of data aggregation and data sharing, and things like holding researchers more accountable for the way that they're using these data. So the first part of the question is, are there other significant barriers that you see that really need to be addressed and where we might need a paradigm change? And the second part of the question is specifically around whether there have been transformations in how research is funded and what the funders expect of you in return.
Great. So I'm going to let each question go, and then we'll just go all the way across, and everyone can respond to the questions that they're most interested in.
So I was just looking for some clarification. That Bill had a great phrase earlier about, this is my data, what right do you have? I'm sort of giving you the right to look at it. But so I'm an academic researcher. I'm not a lawyer. My naive impression wasn't that it was actually entirely that clear with HIPAA and GDPR that just because the patient has their data doesn't mean they have the legal right to share that. So am I just sort of misinformed, or can anybody say something on that front?
Okay, there's a comment posted online, and it reads, I have incurable cancer. I would like to share all my data, omics, reports, imaging, at least for nonprofit, but I cannot foresee how it will impact my family. Please advise.
Thank you. My question is, when we can share the data to the platforms, we are our own data manager, how we are going to control the quality of the data, and where is a part of the education to the patients, the participants, what is the data, how to share the data, how to improve your own data quality. Thank you.
We're just going to go all the way.
In terms of research funding and whether it's any patient engagement is mandated, I think not really. I feel my impression is that these days it's pretty much that there's this fig leaf of outreach and communication that you are supposed to do, but no one really cares, and no funder will not give you money, or will you give you money if you actually do a good job?
I'll take the barriers question. I think my worry about people engaging in DNA or any kind of wearables fitness is some of the pseudoscience that was brought up, this feeling like I'm not getting in return and I just paid for something. Does that have them further disengage in the healthcare system? And then bad actors around the data. We cannot get into a place where people are receding from data and not sharing it. We have a tremendous opportunity with people who have access to their data to share it for more inclusive, richer, more longitudinal research. So I worry. I want to maintain kind of the good actors and the trusted stewards of innovation and science to reign supreme.
Jennifer, I'll try to take your question. Democracy is hard, right, as we see everywhere right now. What Bastian laid out is one of the most interesting experiments in participant-led governance that I know of worldwide. It's also quite hard to harmonize. I think Amanda just said, the things that patients want from their data, the questions that they care about, are often not the questions that a molecular or genetic biologist cares about. And this ties to this time disconnect, because if my goal is finding out the specifics of a variant so I can write a paper on it, that can be quite different from how do I gain autonomy over my care protocol to cope with that variant. And so one of the hypotheses I have is what I call dual use, where you have one database and you have two governors. One is a patient group of governors and one is a research group of governors. And they have different authority to use the database for different purposes, and maybe they even have different research communities. But it's part of the mental model failure that I think we've had is that there's one copy with one governor. And part of what you get from cloud and what you've heard from everyone here today is that you can have one copy with multiple governors, multiple portals to it, as long as you have enough faith in the steward and the infrastructure and the governance that the steward has. So rather than, trying, I think it's important to do hybridization and get patients in with researchers. That is all very important. But I think that can often lead to fundamental disappointment by patients because of the incentive and the timeline misalignments that are inherent in genetic research compared to having a disease that comes from genetics. And so I would encourage you to think broadly into what can you do that allows patients literally to be governors of it without having to integrate with those researchers necessarily. We can talk later.
So I think I'll take the data quality bit. So I'm of the firm belief that data quality needs to be addressed up front. And I think that might be a little bit different than OpenHumans, which seems to be a model that's working really well. So I'm open to discussion around that. But if I were a researcher, I wouldn't want to go in and have to filter through all the bad data to get to what I'm looking for. If I'm doing a research project on GBMs with a certain mutation, I want to trust that what I'm finding is indeed GBMs with that particular mutation. And so I think that a certain amount of work on the front end saves everybody a lot of time on the back end. And then when you start looking at what input may come directly from patients, right? Because it's easy to get it's not easy, but it's easier to get some scientists to agree on these data standards and say, and we're going to have it reviewed twice, or we're going to do whatever those things are, right? When you then throw that out to the masses and have patients inputting their own data, or maybe not even their own data, right? Maybe in a case of a parent, they're inputting data for a child, so it's not even direct input. I think there's still a really valuable space for that for research and for patients. And I think a programmer smarter than I is able to delineate that data within the same data set so that anybody looking at the data can tell this data came from a hospital, from a researcher, this is the source of that data, as opposed to this data came directly from the patient, which is also different than this data came from a patient's device, right? Because there's more regulation around what your watch is telling a system than what a person is typing in. And you can do some things with patient-reported data, like drop-down menus and scales and all of that. But still, at the end of the day, you want them to be able to type in a little something about, I'm concerned about bruising, right? Maybe that's not something that's popped up on the radar yet. But there's a place in the landscape for all of that. But I think the area that we need to really focus on is that moment of input so that we're not having to go back and try to make it align later. It's much easier to do that on the front end.
So I'll opt for the banal and obvious. I remember an early personal genome project meeting, and there was an older gentleman in a wheelchair who approached George Church and said, "You're my last chance." And I thought, oh no. So I just want to encourage people to remember how we got here, and to think about, what is it about our society where every person with a rare disease is in this desperate position of starting their own advocacy group, of starting their own GoFundMe, of going around and shaking every branch, rather than sort of thinking about this as a kind of a basic element of our society.
I love that so much. I would just have to say, if we as a species were serious about solving these diseases, we would have already done it. We could just put sports on hold for a year and take like all of that money and put it to cancer research.
Well, let's not get crazy.
I love sports. No, I want to also address the question of data quality, and this is also kind of a call to action. There are several people in the room that I can see right now that I've had these conversations with respect to clinical data. That is much more the Wild West with respect to harmonization. There are FHIR standards. There are, HL7, but that is like the tip of the iceberg. The data that we all need for cancer research is in the unstructured doctor's notes. And so we need to come up with like a shared common data model, and that's something that we're very, very interested in. So if you are very interested in all of that, we should talk at some point.
There are, and it seems that I am the negative guy today, not Misha, but anyway. There are a couple of concerns that I want to leave the audience today. Not concerns, but I guess, where do we draw the line between an individual and a patient? Because we are talking about patient data, but actually I am potentially a patient. I'm an individual who has his genome sequence, whatever, but at some point I'm going to become a patient. And I think at the moment it's not clear to me, if I wanted to participate to some of these experiments, and I think this is perhaps to do with the barrier, lowering the barrier. I think we need to have much clearer understanding of what it is to be a patient, and perhaps it could be potentially someone who is interested to donate that as well, who doesn't express the symptoms yet. The other issue that I wanted to sort of highlight here is this sort of very blurry spectrum between analyzing your genome for fun and analyzing your genome for clinical purposes. Again, I think that there is a very blurry continuum there that depending on what questions you ask, depending on what you are interested in to find in your personal genome, you are going to have a very different set of frames upon which you can actually perform the analysis. And I think just want to hear your opinions regarding that, because I'm currently quite sort of contradicted.
Well, my father always used to say about me, often wrong but never in doubt, so I'm not conflicted. There's a lot of people here that seem to be interested in talking about issues, how patients go on and get their data into research and whatever, so why not just go on and write some guidelines for it? I mean, it turns out I'm happy to go on and put it out. I don't have to go on and get any kind of academic journal, so for people that have raised the question and are interested actually in doing something about it, show up by my poster at lunch. I'll collect all your cards. Let's see if we can put a document together, and for all these patients that want to get involved in the process, let's put together something first. If you think it's a good idea, I'll put your name on it. If you think it's a bad idea, I'll put my name on it. And then we can go on and get it out there and have the first iteration of making that happen. With respect to the gentleman that asked about HIPAA, generally, the HIPAA is interesting, but in fact, that's not what I encounter. What I encounter is when I go to a doctor, they give me a long document to sign. It's different in every single hospital, and basically the gist of it pretty much is we want to use your stuff for whatever we want to use it for, and there's a chance it'll help you, but we're not making any guarantees, and by the way, after that, it belongs to us. Now, it's a contract, okay? And in the contract, both sides are supposed to go on and get something, but it's also individualized. There's no standardized language that I've seen. So in general, what I always talk to these guys about when I read it is I strike out stuff and I write my own in and say, if it's a contract, it can be negotiated. This is what I want to have happen. And usually these people are so flustered, they just take it and go with it anyway. Okay, and that's the HIPAA thing. In terms of the data quality thing, I had that problem with my hackathon. I put this stuff out. I wound up going on and getting it back again. I was told in retrospect a lot of it was crap, so I wound up doing it again. And so finding out the right quality stuff that you have before you bring all these people in to look at it is probably important, and that'll certainly be a section of the paper that we wind up writing together in terms of advising patients to get this stuff done. Yeah, so those are my comments.
And so I'm going to close by addressing the individual from the internet who wrote, I've been trying for 15 years to have a good answer to your question, and I don't yet. But you should feel free to email me. It's my last name, which is right here at Gmail, and I will connect you to the various places where you can put your data so that it at least has a chance of being used over time. With that, I'd like to thank the panel. I'd like to thank you for letting us delay your lunch by so much. Let's give ourselves a hand.